Now, if you want, you can move the YouTube window further to the left, and then you can see interactively what's going on, how many people are tuning in and things like that.
This one?
No, the other one.
The other one. Do what? Maximize it? Or?
No, probably get on the top and slide the whole window to the left. You only want to see part of it. There, that should do it. It should give you statistics and things like that. All right, let's start with the capture and we're set to go. Are we recording? All right. Well, what we are doing now is very simple summations of the two horoscopes that we have. Part of it will be written, and I'll give you that at the end of the class, and part of it will be oral. These summations are the final part of recapitulating what we have done in previous years. For people who are new to this is a 4th level course. There have been 3 courses that have preceded it, and this is supposed to be a little bit more advanced. And the advancement is mostly in technical things and not so much in astrology. We always try to go deep psychologically if we can. So this time, the next time we meet, we will be doing summaries, and then after that we'll start with the new work, and the new work will be much different than what we have been doing. Now, the courses that preceded this, the one course that preceded this was Character Appreciation with Astrology. And when we did that course, we did several different kinds of summaries. However, since we're just doing a recapitulation now, there's no need to do different kinds of summaries. But I like diversity, so this is going to be different than anything we've done before. What we're going to do this evening is not exactly a balanced general summary of the horoscope of Sigmund Freud. Instead, it will be some general statements about the overall character of Sigmund Freud and his psychology, using his psychology. There will be a few comments from Mysticism, and there will be a few comments from Astrology, clearly, but there's going to be a lot of Freudian psychology. And this is important for several reasons, because the psychology of the man is, in a way, the autobiography of how he approaches things. And since this is meant to be a class as much on mysticism and psychology as it is on astrology, we want to get all 3 working together to understand his character. Now, what we're going to be doing is not psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis is a live procedure. It is a technique that must be done between 2 people working together, and it's almost always done in private. So he would have to be here, and it would have to be a very intimate setting and activity. Now, what we're going to do is a little bit light and a little bit general, but we want to do things in his own words and concepts, because we're trying to get at psychological truth. And it is how he saw the psyche worked. And so that's where we're going to have to learn his terminology. So let's just begin in a simple way. If Freud were standing here next to me, what would we see of his outward personality? Now, a Scorpio rising, we would see someone with a stern visage, probably not severe, but stern. I have never seen a photo of Freud with a smile. It's always stern. That's what you expect with Scorpio rising. They're not the most smiley-faced people of all. He would not be imposing. He was short. He wasn't a big statuesque kind of man. And if we look at our estimation sheets that we have developed along the way, I don't know how I'm going to get these sheets to everybody that is watching over the internet, if there are people watching over the internet. But according to our estimations, Mars is much stronger than Pluto. So Mars would most likely influence his appearances, much more so than Pluto, though Pluto does have a play in it. If we look at the horoscope of Freud, Mars is in Libra, and that would indicate that he would probably be stylish in his clothing. But with Scorpio rising, he wouldn't be a fop. He wouldn't be dedicated to flashy, or he wouldn't be a style maven. And if we look at the horoscope, Pluto is nearly opposite the ascendant, which indicates that there's some discontent, basically in general, with being about his appearances in the external world. He'd never feel comfortable outwardly. Now, Pluto rules race attitudes. Pluto is the planet of prejudice or set racial attitudes. And being Jewish and very keenly aware of his Jewishness, he would probably be very uncomfortable. He would not be, like we have a whole room full of Gentiles here. And for somebody who lived in basically just Jewish society, he wouldn't be comfortable with that. And he especially wouldn't be comfortable being in a class on spiritual astrology because he would think it was all humbug. So looking back at Mars and Scorpio, we see that beside Mars being in Libra, he has 4 planets in Taurus, which gives even more of a Venusian way to the appearances and to the character. So he would probably like conservative but rich clothing, and probably it would be associated with his Jewish society. Mars is in a T-square with Saturn and Jupiter. Now, T-squares are not always bad, but in this case, the stronger part of this T-square is the opposition to Jupiter. And the opposition to Jupiter indicates pride. So he would have a certain amount of pride to his bearing. And if you look at photos of him, all of these things seem to be true. It's just nice to see that astrologically you can get something correct. Now, the bearing, oh boy, this is he would probably be defensive, as we said earlier. He was defensive in almost any outward setting except with his very closest friends. And he used his friends, most of whom were male, almost exclusively male that he hung out with, he used them to protect him, and they formed a screen or a shield around him. Now, as we said, he has 4 planets in fixed signs, and the ascendant is a fixed sign. So with that, we would expect normally a sedentary kind of lifestyle. But the fixed signs don't always mean that. In his case, it meant endurance. He liked to both walk and to hike. He liked to make exhibition, or what is it? He liked to go out searching for mushrooms. And he was a very vigorous hiker. And you couldn't keep up with him. He'd just keep going and going. And he was he loved ancient culture. And if you took him to some place like Rome, he would try to see as many sites as he could see in a day, and sometimes go back to some of them several times. And no one could very much keep up with that. So we see in all of these things, we don't see anything stand out. We don't see somebody that wears exaggerated clothing, or somebody that makes an outward show of himself or anything like that. We see that he's pretty much normal. He had in his life, he had good taste, but nothing extreme. Now, if he were standing here with me, there is one thing that would be extremely obvious. And in noting it, we would want to go into his psychology to understand it. Both his own psychological makeup and his psychological philosophy, because they indicate him to himself. If Sigmund Freud were standing here, he would reek of tobacco. In his prime, he smoked 20 cigars a day. And when you consider that you have to sleep, and I think he probably even smoked cigars when he was working with his patients. In his prime, that was 20 a day. But even after he had several surgeries for cancer of the mouth and the jaw, he still kept smoking cigars. He had devices that to strengthen his jaw, or that he could use his jaw, and he still stuck cigars in them. This is something that is not normal. And the fixity of it is not normal. In that, we can see those fixed sign things coming out. So the first thing we want to do is, was his cigar smoking an addiction? Or was it just a deeply set bad habit? He would think it was a good habit. Now, an addiction normally occurs when you have a foreign substance, a substance that when it is taken in your body develops very quickly a dependence on it. And to rid yourself of that dependence is often quite painful and quite difficult to do. Now, there's a difference between just a simple dependence on a habit and an addictive dependence. Now, it's often difficult to tell whether something is an addiction or whether it's just a habit. Astrologically speaking, addictions are ruled by Neptune. Neptune rules foreign substances, it rules poisons, and it rules psychotropic substances. The symbol of Neptune, as we know, is the trident. the symbol that we use in astrology is not the real thing. It is simplified. Normally, on the ends of the trident, there are hooks. There are barbs, like you see on a fish hook. Once that barb penetrates, to pull it out, you have to take quite a bit of flesh with it. So it's a pretty wicked thing. And you know that tridents are used regularly in Wisconsin? In Lake Winnebago, in the winter, you're allowed to cut big holes in the ice, maybe 3 or 4 feet in diameter, and you stand at the edge of the hole. They usually put antifreeze on the surface of the water, and you stand at the edge of the hole with a trident, they call it a fish spear, until a big sturgeon comes by, and then they try to spear the big sturgeon. And the Native Americans in some of the northern lakes do the same thing when the walleye pike are spawning. They go out with spears of that type and they catch them. So we know that the barb on the end of the trident is very much like the addictive behavior of a substance that once is in you is hard to extricate, hard to pull out. Now there is a psychology with addictions, but since we don't think that Freud was addicted, it's not appropriate to go into at this time. And the reason we don't think that Freud was addicted is because Neptune forms only very weak, just about the weakest aspect of all is a square to the moon. So it's not likely that, that he was addicted. Nicotine is not addictive, but it is habit forming. So he did likely develop a habit. Now, we have proof of the fact, or evidence of the fact, that he was not addicted because he was capable of taking addictive substances without becoming addicted. As we mentioned before, he is a person that brought cocaine to the world. And he could take cocaine, which is pretty highly addictive, and not become addicted. So he was healthy and didn't have that psychological nature that was so addictive. Now, Freudians usually attribute Freud's fixation with cigars on the central complex of all psychoanalysis and Freudian philosophy, and that is the Oedipus complex. So we're going to talk a lot about the psychology of the Oedipus complex because it's central to everything he does. Now, the Oedipus complex is based on the myth of Oedipus. Oedipus was a young man that there was an oracle that said that that told his father that his father would be killed by his own son. So he had the boy put to death by being exposed in the mountains or something like that. And a shepherd found him, and he was taken in to another kingdom, a kingdom where the king didn't have a son, so he raised Oedipus as his own son. And when Oedipus became a young man, he went off on his own and was traveling, and he came to a crossroads, and there he met a man who was coming down the road with a chariot and a bunch of followers and things like that, and Oedipus wouldn't back off. And so he swung his club, I believe it was, and he killed the man. Now, unwittingly, he had killed his father, and he didn't know it. And then he goes into the kingdom, and he solves the the riddle of the Sphinx because the country is suffering from a plague, and it won't be freed until somebody solves the riddle of a Sphinx. And Oedipus solves it. And so he is made king. And as king, he marries the former queen. Unwittingly again, he has killed his father and he has married his mother. And thereby he is committing the greatest taboo of all, incest. Now, it is important to the Freudians the fact that when he killed his father and married his mother, he was not conscious of what he was doing. And the Oedipal complex is based on unconsciousness. Now, according to the Freudians, the Oedipal complex begins about age 5 or 6. This is also the beginning of a dormancy of sexual expression in a physical sense in a child. This is again according to the Freudians. And what happens, instead of having physical sexual activity, there is more fantasy. And at this time, a child, a little boy, we're talking only about boys, the girls will get another treatment on another night, and he focuses on his mother and he wants to marry his mother. And this reawakens in fantasy a sexuality that has been with him since infancy. Now, we have to be very clear about this because many, many people, or most people, misunderstand Freud. Like when you talk about sexuality in infants, it isn't about erections and orgasms or lust or anything like that. It is about pleasurable sensations which are in sex organs or secondary sex characteristics. So Freud is very much misunderstood for that. Little infant boys discover sensations in their bodies, and that's something that almost every parent is aware of. And almost every parent is aware of the fact, I hardly know any mothers where their child didn't where their son didn't at sometimes say, I want to marry you when I grow up. This is not uncommon. Freud is not doing something radically different from personal expression. Part of this happens in that when he has this fantasy, a little boy, that he wants to marry his mother, he realizes also that he has to replace his father. But the father is a big, towering figure, especially when you're about 5 or 6 years old. And the son soon realizes that the father is a very formidable opponent, and he probably can't contend with him. So what happens is that the boy is afraid of his father, and according to Freud, I'm sorry, I have had a cold and it's still bothering me, excuse me very much. The boy fears castration. And the reason he fears castration is that somewhere along the way, he's seen little girls, and he's seen little girls do not have penises, which little boys think is abnormal, unusual. And they conclude that either the penis is going to grow yet, or that it has been cut away, that it has been castrated. Freud even found this in analyses of little children. That little boys either thought that girls would grow penises or that they had lost their penises. Now this is not, Freud tried to do everything by observation. He came to conclusions from his observations that most people would not come to, whether they were true or not true. But everything was founded on observation. All right. When a boy discovers that girls don't have penises, he recognizes that there is a competition with the father. And he doesn't want to be castrated. So what he does is, if you can't beat them, you join them. And what happens is the fear of losing their becoming masculinity represses the desire to marry their mother. This is all happening unconsciously or semi-consciously. This is not, and because they're just mild fantasies at that point, they're fairly easy to repress. Now, when you repress something that is even in the you're only partially conscious of, and it goes into the id, which is his name for the character of the unconscious in its very primitive way. When you do that, there is then a conflict between the ego, where there is consciousness, and between the id, where there is not waking consciousness. And that conflict between the id and the ego is what we call a complex, a neurosis or a neurotic complex. In mysticism, what Freud calls the id is what we call the animal soul, or what we call the lower nature. And the ego in mysticism stands for both the higher self and the waking self in our personality. We've talked about that quite a bit in the back. All right, what happens then is he realizes he can't overcome his father, and so he takes his attention away from his mother and puts it on his father and begins to emulate him. And this is called a transference of attention and an accommodation in order to pass into normal male adulthood. Now, I don't know if all of this takes place in complete consciousness or in demi-consciousness, and if this is something that little boys are aware of, but I think it would take a very well-developed clairvoyance and trained clairvoyance to know exactly what a little boy is conscious of. But I'm willing to give the Freud the benefit of the doubt, because his intuition was so keen. So we can go on with the development of the argument. We'll just give him the benefit of the doubt. But I do know that in all schools of human development, at about the age that Freud is talking of, is when identification with a strong father figure begins. So he's not, like even in anthroposophy, for example, in Waldorf school, at about this time is the period of time, the age when a boy starts identifying with his father. And it is the duty of the father to present an image that can be well taken. So there's something in this that mysticism and psychology of all things agree about. Now, there's something about psychology that once you have experienced it, it is remarkable. And that is, all psychological content is live. and it doesn't die easily. We may have a feeling, or we may have something that we've gone through and then forget about it and then pop back into our consciousness just as live as it's ever been. We have a lot of that it happens. And things are live until after our death, and sometimes they extend well beyond our death, or they are live until they have been neutralized by retrospection or something like that. So the Oedipal complex, or the Oedipal repression, is live. It's always live, and it's continuously with us. I can say that for years was struggling with trying to live a life of generative purity. I can say that the enemy in the lower nature will spring back into my consciousness with sexuality if I'm not completely careful of it. Now, so it puts pressure on the ego, and it puts pressure on the ego continuously. And that we find when we try to grow spiritually. The lower nature does the same thing. Now, this pressure between the unconscious and the conscious is what Freud calls neurosis. And so he's saying that all little boys have this neurosis, and that this neurosis is the basis of all other neuroses. There is something called the electric complex, which we won't go into now, that is the same mythical psychological connection for little girls. And that was something that was developed by Carl Jung, so it's something that we won't go into at this time. Now, since this is the most basic complex, out of which all other complexes spring, it is of central importance. Freud knew this, and he knew that he himself was not immune to psychological process. The same things that every other little boy went through, he went through. Now, he believed a lot in self-analysis, and as he was developing his psychology, he spent a lot of time in self-analysis. He was very detailed, and he was very rigorous, and he was very honest. However, he realized that because of the subjectivity and because of the nature of the id, self-analysis was not enough. And he thought that in order for anyone to practice psychoanalysis, they had to themselves have been analyzed by another proficient analyst. He knew that, and he believed that. But what he did and what he believed in were two different things in this matter. The little analysis by another analyst that he did was always with friends. And his friends were very much under his control. And it's probably not a wise idea to undergo analysis by a friend anyway, because there's a different kind of subjectivity, and it's subjective in other ways as well. And when he did give himself an analysis, he didn't really go all the way in giving himself. This was especially the case with Carl Jung. At one time, Freud and Jung were traveling together, and sometime during the journey, Freud had a dream that he couldn't completely solve. And he mentioned it to Jung, and Jung said, "Let's analyze it." And Freud agreed, and they started analyzing the dream until they came to a symbol in the dream that Jung thought it was important to focus on and associate from. And Freud started to do that, and he went only so far, and then he hesitated. And then he would go no further. And when Jung asked him why, he said, I can't go any further because if I give you my association, the effect of it would be that I would lose my authority with you. Big, important statement right there. So much for science if you only take science as long as you're going to maintain your authority in your field. Now, Freud balked about statements that people made about his psychology, and it was done frequently. Many times it was done jokingly, but he knew very well that even though it was done jokingly, that there was something serious behind it. Now, in this case, it has been suggested that his mini cigars were a pleasurable defense compensation for the loss of his attachment to his mother. He bristled at the subject when it was brought up, which indicates that he was protecting something. Freud did have reasonable relations with his father, but beneath the surface there always was a tension, and things were not smooth. He didn't even make his choice professionally until his father died and he wanted to get married. We want to know astrologically, since this is an astrology and a mysticism course as much as it is psychology, is there evidence of this pleasurable defense compensation? Now, Taurus is definitely a pleasure-seeking sign. Probably of all the earth signs, it is the most pleasure-seeking. And perhaps maybe even of all the signs in the zodiac, the most pleasure-seeking. Taurus does rule the tongue and lower jaw where he had his Cancer. And the seventh house represents compensations or opportunities to feel compensated. And perhaps the compensation that he had with his wife was not sufficient to dissolve or to lessen the tension of the Oedipal complex between his id and his ego. Now, we have an answer to that a little bit, but now we want to go further with this. It's amazing how far you can go with smoking cigars, isn't it? The next question we want to answer is why cigars? Well, for one thing, it was part of Jewish culture. Well-educated Jews that had a good standing in society smoked cigars. That's true to this day. When Freudianism was in its heyday and it entered into literature and a lot of other subjects, the way it went was anything that was longer than it was wide was considered phallic. It got to be that kind of extremity. So the question is whether his cigars were phallic was put to him several times. Are your cigars phallic? And on one occasion he gave the classic answer, which is repeated many times in history, and he says, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It was another way of pushing the question off without answering. Nobody believed that answer, but that didn't bother him. He was pretty much a Taurus Stonewall kind of person. The question for us is, did he have mild homosexual tendencies which would cause him to seek pleasure in sucking on phallic-like objects. And well, that sounds like an indictment. Hard to take. Now, in this we have to be very, very clear that there is no evidence, psychological or historical, that Freud was homosexual in any way. He had normal sexual desires. He was prudent and he was moderate about sexual expression. As we said before, he took the subject very seriously and never told a naughty joke. He knew what could happen. Now, sexuality is not just one thing. There's a spectrum that runs from asexuality through heterosexuality, through homosexuality, to bisexuality, to omnisexuality. It's a spectrum, and like the visual spectrum, the gradations are very fine. So we can rule out definite homosexuality. But Freud taught, and he knew, that all humans are bisexual. A fact which Playboy picked up years later and ran with that ball. So what we want to do is we want to see if there is any astrological evidence of faint tinges of homosexuality in his cigar smoking. Not gross homosexuality. Now this brings us back to the Oedipal complex, the central complex of all complexes. By the way, I should mention it, it is not a stigma to have a neurosis or to have a complex in any form of depth psychology. Both Freud and Jung thought it was impossible to live without complexes and neuroses. It is when they become pathological that there are problems. Astrologically speaking, there is a parallel in that we have to have astrological aspect patterns. There's no way mathematically possible that you cannot have aspects that come into patterns that indicate patterns of behavior and consciousness. So when we use the word complexes and neuroses, we're not trying to stigmatize someone. Anyway, at around age 5, some boys do not make the transference of attention and identification with their mother. They don't completely, some not at all, transfer their attention to the father. Instead, they remain attached and identified with the mother, which means to them that they have to keep it secret from the father. This is why in male homosexuality, it's not just a matter of coming out, is not a matter of coming out because of social stigma. It's a matter of something that you've been protecting ever since you were a little child. Now, there are various reasons why the transference isn't always made. For example, there may be too strong of a bond with the mother that is hard to break. Another reason might be that there is a strong, imposing mother and a weak father. Now the question is, the case, one of the most famous homosexuals in the United States right now is Dan Savage, the man who writes Savage Love, who gives sex counseling both on the internet and in our own Isthmus newspaper. And he is an outright homosexual. And he stated at many times that his mother was a tiger that was in his camp. And that's an example of someone where there is a strong, imposing mother, and he never mentions his father. Maybe there's a reason for that too. Now, the question is is this facet of the Oedipus complex true? Now, in order to answer that, we'd have to do a huge, huge study of homosexuals. And it couldn't be, it would have to be from observation, and it would have to be from some kind of analysis. It isn't something that you could do a statistical study on. Now, Freud did work with many, many cases, and he was a shrewd observer. So I'm willing to give him, again, a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. So we got to keep the class going. We can't fight over something like that. He has a pretty good track record of being correct on things like this. Now, personally, I have worked with quite a few horoscopes of both male and female homosexuals. And what I have learned astrologically is that there are many different etiologies of homosexuality. You can't just say that it's one thing, like in a male Venus square Uranus or something like that. That's often the case, but you can't say it's just one thing. I don't know if all of these cases had a Freudian element or not, because I never really looked into it. But there were definitely cases of looking at male homosexual horoscopes where the onset or the origin of the homosexuality in a male, the only description of it was exactly Freudian. That there was a very strong mother figure that the individual developed under. So, at least sometimes I can speak from my own experience that in some cases Freud appears to be right. I wish I should have. I got some of those horoscopes, and I should be able to look at them and bring them to class. So what we want to see is if there was anything in the horoscope of Freud that would indicate a mild situation, that would indicate a mild tendency to suck on cigars. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. You know, the obvious things in astrology are easy to see, but the things that are mild, much harder to get. Now, for one thing, there are several ways that parents can be located in a horoscope. Opportunities to interact with parents are usually the 4th and 10th houses. But how do you tell who is whom, or who is who? In ancient times and in traditional societies, the 10th house was the father and the 4th house was for the mother. But in our times, for at least the last century, the 4th house is for the father and the 10th house is for the mother. A better way to look at it is that the 10th house represents the objective parent, and the 4th house represents the indirect, subjective, passive-aggressive parent. I am inclined, from looking at this horoscope, to see that Central European Jewish society was extremely traditional, and that the 10th house indicates the father. And so Leo is on the cusp, which would tend to be autocratic, but not exceptionally so. The 4th house would then be for the mother. And the moon is always the mother. Sometimes Saturn, sometimes the sun is the father. So the moon square Neptune, and Neptune in the 4th house, indicates something not very strong. This is the weakest, tied for the weakest aspect in the horoscope, or the moon is tied for the last place in the strength of the planets. But from these facts, we can see that neither the father is dominant, because the son isn't exceptionally strong, nor is the mother a dominant individual. The father is stronger than the mother, which indicates that he was able to make the normal transition from in Oedipal ages to the role of heterosexuality. And he had no trouble in finding and marrying his wife, so he was a natural heterosexual. However, there is that lingering question about the moon square Neptune in the 4th house. Now, it is true that his mother was his protectress. And when he was growing up, and he did maintain a lingering attachment, because there was trouble in the family, because he was sort of a Scorpio rebel. The fact that it is a square is that the square is sufficiently strong to generate a phallic cigar seeking. I don't know. Things like this are not really, lead pipe cinches. You can't be certain about them. It would take a lot of deeper interactions with Freud to know this. But it is enough to be taken into consideration, and that it could very well be the source, according to his own psychology, of that mild tendency to want to suck cigars. Now, we'll give Freud the benefit of the doubt about his theory and say that that's maybe the case. But we want to go deeper than this. And we want to go into his developmental views and how they fit into cigar smoking along with the Oedipal complex. Ela says, all of this for cigars? Yeah, this is nothing compared to what we're going to get into along the way. We're going to have a fun time understanding things astrologically and psychologically. All right. In Freudianism, as we said earlier, the Oedipal complex begins around age 5 or 6. However, that is not the beginning of psychosexual development. According to the Freudians, psychosexual development begins at birth. Again, it must be stated and repeated again very firmly that to an infant, sexuality is not the same thing as it is for adult. If a little boy, a little infant boy, discovers that he has genitals and that it is pleasant to touch them, that's not the same thing as an adolescent masturbating complete with lust and fantasy. It's not the same thing. It's pleasurable, but it's innocent of all of those things that come in later development. Now, there are stages of psychosexual development, even at the earliest time. And the first stage is called the oral stage. And it has to do with sucking the mother's breast for nourishment, for comfort, and for more. And according to this, if there is not sufficient gratification in this stage, there is insecurity. And we find that in thumb sucking and pacifiers and things like that. The oral stage lasts until about the time of weaning. And that is succeeded by the anal stage. And in the anal stage is when we begin potty training. Now, Havelock Ellis, who is a very good sexual psychologist, demonstrated that all organs of elimination are also organs of pleasurable or sensual gratification. For example, going to the gym and having a good sweat, there is a kind of gratification in that. There's a kind of a pleasure in that. Now, the pleasure of elimination is discovered at this same stage, but the parental control in trying to bring potty training is what brings into the child the beginning development of the superego. And the superego is like the conscience, or it is like the higher part of the person that brings us to ethical behavior and things of that nature. So we have now looked a little bit at the id and the ego and at the superego. Now, after age 2, the anal stage is succeeded by the phallic stage. Even in little girls, but we are not going into little girls tonight. And then after the phallic stage, about the time that the Oedipal complex begins, there is a period of sexual dormancy. But what was normally going into pleasurable gratification in the earlier ages goes into the fantasy, like we talked about when we first began talking about the Oedipus complex. Now, how a person passes through these stages of life determines character for the rest of life. If one gets stuck or fixated or too strongly influenced in the anal stage with that super strong superego, they become a Mr. Clean kind of person. Everybody got to be super nice and super clean. Now, I worked with a man who was pretty much an anal type, an anal compulsive. Everything had to be just so. In fact, we even got in a fight over that one time. And every girlfriend that this man had a big fanny. And you laugh at yourself. Freud certainly wasn't right about everything, but he certainly picked up on a lot of things. Now, even if there is family conflict or tension in the family, in these stages, it affects how one develops character, how the personality is developed. Now, to many people, this is preposterous. Suppose, like the Freudian idea that if a parents got into a big argument or fight over at the same time that a child was on a little potty, learning potty training, that this would affect the character for the rest of life. People think this is preposterous, and that the whole idea of this is preposterous. I don't know that it isn't. I think too many people discard all of it and don't really look into what it's really saying. Now, astrologers especially should be open to one part of it. Because as astrologers, we know that the earlier you go back in time toward birth, the more the sensitivity increases. And at the moment of the first breath, the sensitivity is so high that the astral forces that come in with the first breath stamp the character for life. The horoscope lasts for the whole life. And if that is true, the idea that an argument at a specific stage of development should mar future development is not preposterous at all. Students of mysticism should realize that since the sexual force, which we have abused since the fall, is behind everything in the universe, the creation of the universe, the transformation, the sustaining of it, and the dissolving of it. That's all done by what is in essence in the sexual force. It's a potent force, as potent as it is subtle. Now, Freud associates it too much with human sexuality, but probably the rest of the world associates too little with sexuality. And then there are people who study destiny. And in studying destiny, you know that you get exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. There are no mistakes. And if there is an opening, there is an intuition that can come in at that time. So the fact that you need to have bickering parents at a certain stage in life is not an accident. Almost any psychologist of any school realizes that the first few years of life, especially the first 3 years of life, are extremely important in the formation of character. Rudolf Steiner says, for example, that the events that happen in the earliest childhood determine the things from past lives that has to be rebuilt into the physical body that's when they occur. Those things that later on that Rolfers or deep tissue massagers get rid of at the same time that there is a psychological release, those are built in those first years. So what Freud is saying is not something extreme and out of the way. Now, if there is any argument with Freud, it's probably over the materialism of it and the fact that he doesn't go deeper into things and that he is a determinist and that there is no freedom. Those are arguments that you can level successfully against Freud, but many of the things that he is discarded for are just not so. So the question is, did Freud have oral compulsive tendencies manifest in cigar smoking? He definitely was not anal. He was not a super neatnik, and he definitely was not phallic because he didn't have grandiose worldly ambitions. So the answer is, with what's left and with his own psychology, the answer is probably. Now, it would probably require a long-term analysis and a really sensitive study, like out of the memory of nature, to see if the family history backs it up. So it's you can see what we're dealing with here. It's clear. So we have almost no time left. In fact, we are overstayed our hour already. I don't think YouTube will be on us. So let's just collect what we have. We're supposedly trying to summarize the general character of Freud in his own terms, while incorporating astrology and mysticism into the process and using them as verification. We didn't get very far. We never do. We began with a simple description of him physically, as if he were here. And then when we got to cigar smoking, and the reasons for it, we opened up something that, as you can see, was very large, that we didn't have really enough time to do it justice. We concluded, using his own concepts, that it is likely that he did not make a complete transference in the Oedipal complex, such that he was left with a very, very light attachment to his mother, which did not result in homosexuality, but it did turn him into being someone who was passive and receptive. It was enough to produce a longing that was worked out in a defensive, pleasurable gratification. We also noted that he had mild tendencies of an oral compulsive type of character, and if 20 cigars a day isn't compulsive, I don't know what is. Now, all of these things are in a range, considering human behavior, that is normal. That, these 20 cigars a day is quite a bit, but it's not abnormal. So, though far from complete, these things give us a pretty good general assessment of his psychology. And the cigars led us right into his character so that we could get at the general nature of his psychology. We're going to want to go deeper later on, and we're going to want to go into his psychology itself more later on. Now, because we're out of time, I'm heartbroken because I wanted to do or see this same material in the light of mysticism. Years ago, I gave that course called Triangle Myths, or Triangles in Mythology. And they relate to the three attributes of Trinity: the divine spirit, the Father, the life spirit, the Mother, and then the child being the human spirit. But we couldn't possibly go into that tonight, but we will get to it somewhere along the way. Now, next time, what we're going to try to do is we're going to look at the general summary of Carl Jung. Now, these are synthesis and summary charts for helping you to write a summary. If you would, you might just well stay here because I have another one. And this is an oral summary. You can try to write your own, and you can use the first handout as a means to get at that. Now, the table that is called Synthesis and Summary Chart is not a restatement of everything that we've done before in the last 2 or 3 years. It is a taking of the most important parts of them and relating them to each other in such a way that you can draw a general picture of the character in a way that is balanced and proportionate to what his nature was. All right. There will be no class next week. I am a very fanatic gardener, and so every now and then I have to take a week off to do seasonal gardening, and that's what I'll be doing next week. And the week following next week will be a mysticism talk. And so the next time the astrology meets will be 3 weeks from tonight, provided I'm still alive at that point. Any questions? Well, thank you very, very much. We should have some way